Hi everyone, welcome to the video series on the question type inferences, and in this series we'll be taking up difficult level questions, the questions which are released by College Board. Now before you run through these videos, I would request you to take up the introduction and identification video of inferences and then the strategy video for inferences. Then the third step should be to come to this video series so that the questions make sense to you and you also understand how I am taking up the questions for this type, right? So all of this will be relevant to you. Now let's go ahead and see the first question. So we already know the first step of taking up any question type would be to read the question stem. So this is the question stem. Which choice most logically completes the text? So logically completes, the mention of this tells me that this is an inference question type. Correct. Now we already know the inference question type, the texts are pretty lengthy and the sentences are pretty long, right? So how do we read it? We break down the sentences into various parts, try to make sense out of whatever has been given, try to connect the dots, read between the lines, and then we try to predict what is the information that can really complete the whole text. Now let's go ahead and start reading. So Mata and colleagues, 2010 Mediterranean Sea Biodiversity Census. So we are talking about, let's just call them MC, right? Their Mediterranean Sea Biodiversity Census, we are talking about their census, right? Reported, so the census reported approximately 17,000 species, nearly double the number reported in CC's census. So what's happening? Take a break over here and understand what's happening. So whatever the number of species were reported by MC was like 17,000 species, which is nearly double the number of whatever the CC's census reported, right? So 17,000 species, they reported that they have found 17,000 species. This number is just double the number whatever was released by CC's 2000 census. Now what happened, right? What changed so drastically? Let's read ahead. A difference only partly attributable. So now this is talking about the difference. Why? What is the reasoning behind that difference? But the problem is that this is only partly attributable to whatever the reason is that's been given to us in this sentence. Right? The reason that we had such a high number of species being reported, there was a reason for it, and this reason given over here in the sentence is only partly attributable, which is this is only a part of the reason, right? This is not a complete reason or the only reason, just a very small part of the reasonings. Now what is it? A difference only partly attributable to the description of new invertebrate species in the interim. So there was an introduction of new species, new invertebrate species, right? Because of this, the number was so high in the 2010 census reported by MC. But this reason is just a part of all the reasons. It's a small part of all the reasons. Now let's read ahead. Another factor is that, so now we have another factor or another reason is that the morphological variability of microorganisms is poorly understood compared to that of vertebrates, invertebrates, plants and algae. So now take a pause over here. What are they saying? Another reason is that the morphological variability of microorganisms is not that greatly understood as compared to that of vertebrates, invertebrates, plants and algae. So all these things, right? So another reason for such a high number of species being reported is that the variability of microorganisms or the morphological variability of microorganisms is not understood properly. There's not much understanding in that particular area. Creating uncertainty. So because of this kind of not understanding or just not being understood correctly, what is happening because of that? Creating uncertainty about how to evaluate microorganisms as species. So there is an uncertainty about how to assess a particular microorganism as a species, right? There is a problem because of this poorly understood factor of morphological variability of microorganisms, Because of this, we don't know how to evaluate microorganisms as species. So if you try to connect the dots with the previous problem that's been said, the problem as to the species, the number of species reported was very high in 2010, we can already think that probably the reason is because we don't know how to evaluate microorganisms as species, right? Maybe that's the problem, right? Now let's read ahead. Researchers' decisions on such matters, therefore, can be highly consequential. Now, they're saying the same thing, that, because of this problem that they have just mentioned to us earlier, that there's uncertainty about how to evaluate microorganisms as species. Because of this, the researchers' decisions can vary, right? Can be impacted. Their decisions will be impacted for sure, because they just don't know how to evaluate microorganisms as species, right? So probably that is the reason why the number of species reported has been so high, right? Now let's read ahead. Indeed. So how do we use the word indeed? We basically use the word indeed to explain something further, right? So here there is more explanation coming up. So let's just read this. Indeed, the two censuses reported similar counts of vertebrate, plant and algae species, suggesting that. So what was the common part of the two reports? The common part was that they reported similar counts of these three things. Right, these three species, the counts were similar. So what does this suggest? This suggests that the problem was probably with the microorganisms, right? That was the problem, because of which the number of species was so high that was reported in 2010's census. Now with this understanding, let's go to our options. Now option A says that C and colleagues, CC, that's reported a much higher number of species than B and M did, largely due to the inclusion of invertebrate species that had not been described at the time of B and M census. So this particular bit is hinting towards the new invertebrate species, right? But remember what the text said. The text explicitly states that the difference in species counts is only partly attributable to the description of new invertebrate species. So that's a very small part, right? Only partly attributable to this new invertebrate species. What does this mean? This means that the other factors must also be contributing to the difference, which this option does not address, right? So this option is not talking about the other factors. In fact, it's contradicting the text by saying that it was largely the high number of species reported was largely because of this reason, which was only partly attributable as per the text, right? So A is incorrect because what is it doing? It's contradicting the text. It's not stating the right information from the text. Now let's look at B. Some differences observed in microorganisms may have been treated as variations. So we are talking about some differences that were observed in microorganisms, and that those differences were treated as variations within species by B and M, but treated as indicative of distinct species by C and C. So remember, B and M, they had a lesser number reported, right, in their census. And when it comes to M, C and colleagues, they reported a much higher number, right? So probably the C and colleagues, they treated them as distinct species, but when it came to the B and M, they treated them as one within a particular species, right? That is how we can say that the number that they reported, the Mata, Kaul and colleagues, they reported was so high, because they clearly created some more distinction, right? So that is how they had higher number. So B completely makes sense. So this option is correct because it directly addresses the issue of how differences in the interpretation of morphological variability, right? That's what they're talking about. Morphological variability of microorganisms could lead to species counts, right? The text is highlighting that the understanding and evaluation of microorganisms are uncertain. We are not sure of it, right? What is it doing? It makes researchers' decisions on such matters highly impactful, right? Their decisions are being impacted. This option B is basically logically completing the text by explaining how B and M might have treated these variations differently compared to C and colleagues, right? So I like this option because it's giving me an explanation behind such a drastic difference. Correct? Now let's go to C. What is C saying? B and M may have been less sensitive to the degree of morphological variation displayed within a typical species of microorganisms than C and colleagues were. Now, read this particular option very carefully. You will be able to identify something or a word that can definitely make your option choice go incorrect, right? I mean, look at this bit, less sensitive towards something. What were they more sensitive towards, or what were they less sensitive towards? I really have no idea because the text is not talking about it. Right, this option is suggesting that B and M were less sensitive to morphological variation. It does not directly explain the high number of species reported by C and colleagues. Correct? How is there sensitivity towards something telling us why did MC and colleagues report such a huge number? The text is focused on how the understanding and classification of microorganisms can impact species counts. It's not about the sensitivity of the researchers. So only because of the mention of this word less sensitive, because it's not about the sensitivity of the researchers, choice C goes wrong. So this option is incorrect because it's irrelevant, right? It's just irrelevant to the text. It's not been discussed. The sensitivity is not been discussed. Let's go to D now. Okay, so the absence of clarity regarding how to differentiate among species of microorganisms may have resulted in C and colleagues underestimating the number of microorganism species. So this word underestimating, so the MC and colleagues clearly did not underestimate any number. The number that they reported is it's double the number reported by C, B and CM. Right, so it's definitely they are not underestimating anything. Now this option is incorrect because it contradicts the information provided in the text very clearly. The text is explaining that the 2010 census reported nearly double the number of species compared to 2000 census. It really does not talk about the underestimation. It's clearly about the overestimation, right? So underestimating, this word is making this option incorrect and contradictory as well. So clearly for this particular question, I could eliminate one option because it was irrelevant and two options because they were contradictory, and B clearly is your correct answer. Thank you so much.